So today I'm here to talk about the new WordPress plugin directory that was launched a couple months ago. And it is one of the projects that I worked on as part of my job at Automatic. I'm part of a team there that gets to work full-time on WordPress core and the WordPress.org infrastructure. And so that's also why I worked on WordPress 4.3. I was the release lead for that release. I was lucky enough to also work on the theme directory that we relaunched a couple years ago. And one of my most recent projects that I worked on was the plugin directory. And we started working on that actually in January 2016. And by WordCamp Europe last year, which was in June, we were ready to kind of ship an open beta, and I presented that in Vienna. I'm sorry, and my next project after that was to do a Calypso rotation. So Calypso is the new administration experience on WordPress.com, and I was due for a rotation there for 6 months. Calypso is written in React, and so kind of as a small learning project for myself, I decided to rewrite the plugin directory in React and kind of get myself acquainted with the framework and see how you can use it and how easy it is. And it turned out to be really, really easy actually. So I'm Konstantin Obenland. I'm on the internet pretty much everywhere under @Obenland, on Twitter, GitHub, Instagram if you like pictures. I also blog at konstantin.obenland.it with more pictures. I'm really terrible at writing. But if you're interested in nice pictures, you should totally check it out. Yes, so I worked on it for the plugin directory, and I started, like I'm not finished with the entire thing yet, to be honest. I'm not able to, I was not able to use my own computer for this presentation, so you're spared of having to look at a semi-finished React app. You're welcome. And but I do want to talk about the setup. I do want to talk about how you can get involved, and I do want to talk about how I approach the challenge, I guess, of marrying WordPress and React. So in terms of the setup, by the way, this is how the new plugin directory looks. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it. New design. And in terms of setup, the base, or probably the easiest way to get started with it is to use the WordPress meta environment. This is an environment that is based on Vagrant, and it uses the VVV WordPress development environment. So if you're already working with VVV for your, which is varying vagrants, I think, for your everyday development, this is just another, I don't know, piece of, another development environment exclusively for the WordPress.org sites, right? And so if you go to github.com/WordPress/meta environment, it'll give you an installation instruction. It'll show you how to set up varying vagrants, and also show you how to set up the meta environment. And the plugin directory is part of that. One of the major goals that we had with relaunching the plugin directory on WordPress.org was to open source the code, because previously, like the previous version, was all closed source. So there was a very limited amount of contributors who were able to work on it, right? And so, yeah, one of our major goals was to bring it over to a public repository. And then the other goal was to relaunch it on WordPress, right? And use WordPress for a change. Before that, it was run by a very old bbPress installation. If you've never heard of bbPress, it's kind of like a forum software for WordPress. Yes, so that's the reason why it's open source. That's the reason why now everyone can get started with the meta environment and test the plugin directory or the theme directory for that matter, and help contribute to it and yeah, work on tickets that are on the meta track as well. The next building block for the React app on the plugin directory, excuse me, is the WordPress REST API client. So Noel Tuck this morning talked about the WordPress REST API and the projects that HumanMade has realized with the REST API. One of the projects that the WP API team has put out too is a library that you can use with your JavaScript application, kind of like as an abstraction layer for the REST API, right? That makes it really, really easy to talk to whichever WordPress site you use or you work on and get data out of it or update data or whatever you need to do with it. And so, yeah, this React client uses that as well, which, yeah, just saved me from hours of work having to recreate all that and having to build an API layer that would be able to communicate with the WordPress REST API endpoints. So these are the major two building blocks that I use for this React application. So if you're looking for inspiration in terms of like how to get started with your own React apps building on WordPress, or better tools for that, I highly recommend you check out the WP API repository on GitHub and see how you can use it for your purposes. It's really, really neat. I think they also released a new version yesterday or today that fixed a bunch of bugs as well. Yeah, looking under the hood, I'm going to show you code. I think you got spared in terms of like code slides so far, but there is code and quite a bit of it. So I hope you bear with me. The plugin directory is pretty much based on a plugin and a theme that we use in a regular WordPress multi-site installation. It's pretty basic. Everyone here can download it and set it up on their own sites. And one of the things, like the base of it all is a custom post type called plugin. We were really creative with our naming here. And the important part for making it compatible with your React app is to show that post type in a REST API response, right? And make that REST aware if you want, or API aware if you want. And additionally, we added custom taxonomies and metadata that we attached to this post type, right? So metadata like downloads, for example, right? Every plugin has a certain amount of downloads. And with the updated register meta function, I think it was updated in 4.7, we're now able to be a lot more specific in terms of telling WordPress how to deal with certain data, in this case, downloads, right? So we can tell WordPress it's an integer. When we sanitize it, to always sanitize it with, or to make it an absolute integer, and to also show it in REST. Yes. So this allows not only the custom post type, but also the custom taxonomies and metadata like downloads to be part of the REST response. So this is an example of a response object for the Akismet plugin in this case. And as you can see over here, boom, we have a meta array, or meta object rather, with metadata. And this is all registered through the register meta function calls. Like ratings, active installs, downloads, all of this, which is now part of the REST API response and can be used through the API JavaScript layer that I just mentioned. So that is able to now communicate with the REST API and specifically ask for plugins, and also is able to use this meta information to narrow down responses, right? Yes, so let's look at some components and let's look at how this is built and set up. Right, so also this is public information. It's available through the internet. It's on meta.track.wordpress.org. You can see it up here. And you can look it up yourself. It's pretty much just a basic WordPress theme, as I mentioned before. What we're doing is we maintain a PHP and a JavaScript version of the site in parallel, which allows us to not have to worry about any kind of SEO hiccups or anything like that. We just, when we render the plugin directory with the React app, we just render it, like any other time, and only subsequent page views that were initiated by the user are being rendered in React, right? So this way, we don't have to worry about any kind of SEO implications, and bots can just crawl the markup and follow any links that it finds in there. And like new page loads, of course, will render in PHP as well. So the entire React application is in the client folder, and within that folder, the top level, I guess, file is index.jsx, and if we look at that, you see it's really, really small. It just goes ahead and grabs the content div, so any the div that has the ID content, and then renders the provider component in there, which we get from React Redux. React Redux is a library that allows React to talk to our data store, which is Redux in this case. And it sets up a store and gets the routers from the router module. That is something that I configured manually. And this is really all that it does on the initial load. The store is really not that interesting, but the router component is. The router is the component that decides which component to load depending on the URL that the user inputs, right? So, for example, if we browse popular plugins, right? We would hit this path right here. It would load the archive browse component, and we can look at that in a second, and it would pass it the type of the component that we want to look at. In this case, it would be popular. Let's go back. Yeah, an archive browse is in components, and these are all the different components that make up our site. Archive, browse, and let's go back. Archive, browse. And then in index, what you see, this is called a query component or a higher order component. And what it does is it's self-sufficient in terms of like getting the information it needs, right? So we saw that the router just loads that component and doesn't, give it anything other than the slug of the type that the user wants to see. Like it doesn't give it like the list of plugins that it's supposed to show. And so this is pretty much self-sufficient in terms of it just takes the slug of the URL that we give it, and it then itself goes back and creates a request and requests information about the plugins that it needs to show on that page. And so this is pretty much a component that handles the request of the data and the data storage, I guess, and then returns in the render function returns the browse component. And the browse component is ultimately the component that then takes the data that was requested and feeds that into, and feeds that into, where is it? Type. And feeds that into plugins and gets the plugins for this specific section, right? So this is just one way to do it, of course, but that's the way that the archive kind of works. Let's go back. And the pretty thing about that, what I really like about this whole approach is that these components are actual components, and you can theoretically you can just move them wherever you need them to be, and they would still work because like within each component, all relative parts work out. So you have styles associated with this specific section of your website, correlated with the component that it corresponds to, I guess. So it's really, really neat. It's very easy to structure, right? And I think I have a slide on that as well. It's very easy to structure and to reuse as well. And super fast, of course, for the end user. Components. Redux. So I mentioned that. Redux was the data store that I chose. You can use, of course, any kind of data store. You can use Flux or whatever you prefer. Redux was the one that Calypso uses, and I wanted to prepare myself for how Calypso approaches things, and so I decided to go with Redux as well. It's a little bit of a slow start if you get started with Redux, but once you grasp the concept, it's really, really neat. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but there's developer tool extensions that you can use to take a look at how Redux fires its actions and how the state tree kind of changes with each action, right? So in this case, we were loading a page and the route changed, right? So Redux is aware that the route changed when we load a new page. And going through the different component trees, we're at, in this case, I think it was an archive page. We're at a point where we load plugins. We're requesting plugins from the server, right here. And then we wait a while, and then after a while, we get plugins back, which is the plugins receive action. And then also with the successful request, we also fire a success event. And that allows us to, show a spinner, for example, and with a successful request, hide that spinner and show the plugins instead. And on the right side, you see the state tree. And in this case, I expanded the sections of the state tree, and you see the different types of sections. Browse and section is pretty much interchangeably. You have favorites, which is a custom taxonomy. So you have an ID for this taxonomy as well. You have a count of how many plugins are in that taxonomy, a description, a link, and a slug as well. So favorites would probably be the one that would respond to that. Yeah. And so with the ID of favorites, we can then go back and request plugins from the server that have a taxonomy with that ID, right? And so that allows us to then populate our plugins object further up. The isFetching flag is something that you can use to then, as I said, like show a spinner or hide it and update that, which is what the request success actions for, or failure in case it does fail. Yeah, so this is an example site. This is the featured archive or archive of archive view, if you want, of feature plugins. And so it all starts with the content frame. It's really hard to see, but it's up here. So this is the outside. This is kind of like the content ID that I mentioned earlier, right? A header and a content type, and a main frame, if you want. This is white on white, so it's hard to read, I guess. And then you have a plugin component, and with each plugin component, within each plugin component, you have icons, and you have ratings, and you have a meta part, right? And these are all separate components that are just being requested by each higher component. And so the benefit there, again, especially with Redux, is that the higher component doesn't need to know what kind of data the lower component needs, right? Like, so that the parent component doesn't need to know the data needs of the child component. Like each component kind of does that on its own, which is really, really neat. This is what it looks like in kind of like an HTML view or form, if you want. So you have the site main, which is the main content, as I just showed, and then you have the browse container. The container is the query component. So the container pretty much just handles the data that the browse component needs. And then we have archive browse, and there we have a list of plugins. So connect is a higher order component that connects our component to Redux, the Redux store, and allows the component to get the data it needs, right? And then within each plugin cart, so that is the plugin that I just mentioned, we have a plugin icon component, and then in this case, if it was finished, we would also have the rating component and the meta component as well. Yeah, so this is pretty much it. I just want to give you a quick overview over how I approached a React app with the plugin directory. So far, it's not finished. The plugin directory does use React, however, to render the screen show slider. Like every plugin can add screenshots to their plugin site, I guess. And so this is written in React. And I think it's the first feature that WordPress itself, like the WordPress project, uses that is written in React. Yeah, again, if you would like to contribute, which would be great, tomorrow is Contributor Day. I'll be there. If you want to learn more about this project, if you want to learn more about contributing to Meta or Core, totally come up and talk to me. I'd love to help you out. The WordPress meta environment is the start for all that. Again, it's on github.com/WordPress/meta environment. And I encourage you to check it out and play with it a little bit and see how you like it. And with that, I would take questions.